Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today I will analyze the case of Christ Koulis. First, I'll look at the background of this case, move to the timeline of the crime, then offer my analysis. Christ Pete Koulis was born on September 22, 1967, and lived in the state of Illinois. There is some confusion with his name in the media. It is spelled C-H-R-I-S-T, but the T is silent, so he pronounced his name Chris. When Chris was 19, he started medical school. In the 1990s, he moved to Nashville, Tennessee, to complete a plastic surgery residency at Vanderbilt University. He started practicing in Tennessee in the late 1990s. Chris became well known because he frequently deployed bathroom stall advertising. I imagine this could have led to a problem based on how people make associations. For instance, when people had an urge to evacuate, they thought about Christ Koulis. Maybe he figured, just like the toilet seat, his face could make a long-lasting impression. I suppose advertising in bathroom stalls could lead to some catchy lines. For example, "Are you ready to flush excess fat? Call Dr. Koulis. You're already shedding extra weight. Why not keep the momentum going? And when you're done with number 2, call your number 1 surgeon." In March 2000, Christ Koulis became romantically involved with a woman named Lisa Renee Buchanan. Lisa had been born in 1970 and grew up in Dayton, Ohio. She married a man named Steve and had a daughter named Jessica. The dreams that Lisa had for her life were larger than what she was experiencing. She believed that she could be a movie star, and she wanted to write film scripts. As a stepping stone toward her goals, she began modeling. Lisa divorced Steve and moved to Nashville to pursue fame and glory. Initially, she left her daughter Jessica with Steve. The romantic relationship that Lisa had with Chris was consistent with her desire for stardom. A key part of the attraction was how Chris had a large amount of money. He paid many of Lisa's expenses. Over the next 5 years, the couple had an on-again, off-again relationship, which was largely based on Lisa receiving money and Chris receiving sex. The romance was tumultuous and eventually involved drug use. Chris and Lisa were both using Demerol, which Chris obtained illegally. In May 2002, when the couple was living in Kentucky, Chris decided to go to a substance use rehabilitation clinic, but Lisa remained in the house where they had been living. Concerned for Lisa's safety, a relative checked on her in the house. Lisa was in bad shape. She had several infections of injection sites. She was severely impaired and in an altered mental state. Lisa was taken to a hospital and treated. The police investigated the incident. Lisa told them that Chris injected her with Demerol to keep her, quote, "nice and naked," unquote. Chris was charged with several offenses, but Lisa refused to testify against him. Ultimately, he was convicted of only one charge, unlawfully supplying drugs. His sentence was probation. In addition to this conviction, Chris ran into another problem in 2002. He admitted that he had sex with 2 patients, which represented an ethical violation. His license was suspended, and he moved to Chicago, Illinois. Despite Lisa claiming that Chris was responsible for her Demerol use and almost killing her, the couple reconciled about 6 months later. Chris paid for an apartment for Lisa to live in. It was in Franklin, Tennessee, about 21 miles south of Nashville. Chris would regularly travel from Illinois to Tennessee to have sex with Lisa. In 2003, the state of Illinois issued Chris a probationary license. He was practicing medicine despite being convicted of a serious crime in Kentucky. Now moving to the timeline of the crime. On July 2, 2005, Christ Koulis flew from his home in Illinois to the apartment he rented for Lisa in Tennessee. He brought with him a duffel bag full of sex toys, syringes, and medication. 2 days later, on July 4, 2005, at 2:22 p.m., Christ Koulis called 911. He told the operator that Lisa had stopped breathing. Chris performed CPR as emergency responders were on their way. Lisa was transported to a hospital where she was pronounced dead. Here is the story that Chris supplied to the police. He had traveled to Tennessee to have multiple marathon sex sessions with Lisa. On July 4, Lisa was in the bedroom watching Pirates of the Caribbean when she called Chris and said she wasn't feeling well. When he entered the bedroom, he noticed that Lisa's lips were blue. He slapped her, then moved her to the living room floor to perform CPR. In another version of the story, Chris said that Lisa collapsed on the living room floor. There was no mention of going into the bedroom first. Here's what the police found during the course of their investigation. Lisa had oxycodone, hydrocodone, and Xanax in her system. Physicians believe that the oxycodone killed her, although this determination was later disputed. Lisa had 6 puncture wounds in her groin area, which were consistent with being injected by a needle. The wounds were in alignment, suggesting a degree of precision. Lisa's apartment was full of drugs and syringes. In Chris's duffel bag, the police found an 18-gauge needle, which was the same size needle used to inject Lisa. Using an 8mm camcorder, Chris had recorded 2 hours of romantic contact with Lisa. The authorities described the behavior as wild sex. At one point during the video, Lisa could be seen holding gauze on her groin. Chris advised her to put pressure on it. The video did not capture Chris injecting Lisa. Despite this, the police believed that he did. Based on the law in Tennessee, if a person injects another with drugs and causes death, they can be charged with second-degree murder. In November 2005, Christ Koulis was indicted on charges of second-degree murder and reckless homicide. He was released on bail and returned to Chicago to continue with his medical practice. On September 13, 2007, the murder trial started. Christ Koulis testified on his own behalf. He denied supplying the oxycodone to Lisa. He denied injecting her, and he said he did not know she had returned to using substances. He believed she was still sober. On September 28, 2007, Christ Koulis was found not guilty of second-degree murder and not guilty of reckless homicide. He was found guilty of criminally negligent homicide, which is a lesser charge the jury was allowed to consider. On December 5, 2007, Chris was sentenced to the maximum of 2 years in prison, but released on a $500,000 bond as he appealed his conviction. In addition to this sentence in the state of Tennessee, the conviction was a violation of his probation in Kentucky. If convicted of violating his probation, he was facing up to 5 years in prison there. By this point, every state which had issued Chris a license had either suspended it or revoked it. Despite this, he was able to find a job. Chris worked as a medical consultant for a law firm in Chicago. The state of Tennessee was hopeful that Chris would lose his appeal and be sent to prison to serve his sentence, but they were disappointed. The appeal was never heard, and Chris never went to prison. This is because on March 26, 2010, Chris died of opiate intoxication and pneumonia. After his death, his conviction for criminally negligent homicide was vacated. Now moving to my analysis. Until his death in 2010, Chris maintained his innocence. His supporters argued that the evidence was insufficient to prove that Chris actually injected Lisa. She could have injected herself. Many people who use substances do that. The state, of course, disagreed. They argued that when considering the totality of the evidence, it is clear Chris injected Lisa, like when factoring in their long history together and his behavior. He should have been convicted of second-degree murder. This brings me to the question, was Christ Koulis guilty of any crime in connection with Lisa's death? Let's take a look at the evidence both for and against the idea that he was guilty, starting with the inculpatory factors. In his relationship with Lisa, Chris had a history of being controlling, demanding, and manipulative. Some of his behavior looked a lot like stalking. The arrangement with Lisa was straightforward. She was a service provider. Her job was to supply Chris with sex. His job was to supply her with money. Lisa once told an acquaintance Chris was coming to town and it was time to pay the rent. This is an arrangement that they both agreed to, but Chris initiated it. He shaped her life in many ways. He performed several plastic surgeries on Lisa, including breast augmentation. He paid for her apartment, which was packed with sex toys. And in 2002, during the incident in Kentucky involving the Demerol, Chris may have caused Lisa's addiction. This gave him even more control over her. This incident also demonstrated that Chris injected Lisa. If he did that in 2002, it stands to reason he could have done that in 2005. During the incident on July 4, 2005, Chris was in Lisa's apartment for the purposes of sex. he brought a duffel bag full of sex toys and medication for erectile dysfunction. In the apartment, the police found a massive quantity of syringes and drugs in plain view, yet Chris said he thought Lisa was still sober. Medical experts indicated that Lisa died from an overdose of oxycodone. Through his work, Chris had access to this drug. Lisa did not have any obvious way to obtain oxycodone outside of Chris. Lisa had 6 injection marks on her groin, which were neatly aligned, as if somebody with medical training had injected her. It would have been difficult for Lisa to have injected herself based on the angle. In Chris's duffel bag, the police found an 18-gauge needle, which was the same size used to inject Lisa. In his home in Chicago, investigators found dissolved oxycodone pills. Chris admitted on the stand that he continued to have sex with Lisa even though she was reporting pain in her shoulder, chest, and left arm. This is inconsistent with a person who cared for Lisa and was maintaining a genuine romantic relationship. Chris had a history of being deceptive. For example, despite being convicted of a crime in Kentucky, he lied to the state of Illinois to get his license, declaring that he had never been convicted of any criminal offense. And Chris offered different stories about how he discovered that Lisa was sick in her apartment. Moving to the exculpatory factors, although Chris admitted that he brought syringes to the apartment, he claimed they were for his erectile dysfunction. Specifically, he could give himself an injection to bring down an erection. Chris explained the instruction he gave to Lisa about putting pressure on the gauze. Again, this was captured in the 2-hour video. He said that she had already injected herself. He was just trying to help her in the aftermath. There were many syringes in Lisa's apartment, but none of them contained fingerprints from Chris. There is no proof that Chris supplied Lisa the oxycodone. Lisa had a history of using substances. She used them even when Chris was not around. Her internet history from 2005 revealed searches for drugs. It is certainly possible she could have injected herself. Medical experts for the defense argued that the last injection of oxycodone is not what killed Lisa. Rather, it was the cumulative effect of crushing and injecting pills over the course of years. This left filler in her lungs, which is what killed her. When considering all the evidence in this case, do I believe that Christ Koulis was guilty of any crime? I believe he was guilty of second-degree murder in reality, but I am not convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that he was guilty of any crime connected to Lisa's death. The state could not prove that Chris supplied drugs to Lisa or injected her. If he did not engage in at least one of those actions, there was no crime committed, not even criminally negligent homicide. Chris's defense made a good case that he was a spectator rather than an active participant in Lisa's drug use. What do I think happened in this case? This is just a theory, my opinion. Christ Koulis was self-centered, immature, impulsive, irresponsible, grandiose, arrogant, condescending, manipulative, demanding, controlling, deceptive, cold, callous, hedonistic, addicted to substances, had a sense of entitlement, possessed a powerful sex drive, and was exceedingly creepy. Unlike some offenders who possess superficial charm, Chris fell short in this category. He did not have any charm. He relied on his status as a physician and his money to get his way. Lisa Buchanan was immature, grandiose, and addicted to substances. She became dependent on Chris to maintain her drug habit. This left her in a position where she was willing to do whatever he wanted, including marathon sex sessions. On July 4, 2005, Chris injected Lisa to add more pleasure to their sexual encounters. Lisa was a willing participant. Even so, Chris committed second-degree murder in the state of Tennessee. Without any direct evidence of him injecting Lisa, he managed to escape a murder conviction. In a sense, he was even able to escape the lesser conviction of criminally negligent homicide. The one thing he could not escape was his substance use problem. Chris's insatiable desire for pleasure ended Lisa's life. Then it came for him. Those are my thoughts on the case of Christ Koulis. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you soon.